Dragon's Dogma is a true underrated gem, but why was the game so underappreciated and misunderstood by mainstream players? To fully understand why Dragon's Dogma gained its cult following, we need to travel back in time. The year is 2012, and Dragon's Dogma is released for the PS3 and Xbox 360 on the 22nd of May. The game was well received in Japan, and in the Western world, Dragon's Dogma received generally positive reviews. But there was two things standing in its way of mainstream success: Dark Souls and Skyrim. Getting released 6 months earlier, they got a devastating head start. Not to mention that these both already had a strong following of players waiting for the next title. Skyrim simply had better RPG elements, and Dark Souls was already positioned to become the ultimate challenge for RPG gamers. Dragon's Dogma just could not compete with these two titles and was pushed back into the shadows. We have to remember though, it was the first time an open world had been proposed for a Capcom title, but they eventually improved the project after Itsuno scaled down his initial proposal to fit within projected budget and development resources. His original version of the game was substantially larger than the final game, and sadly, over 60% of the original content was cut, including the whole of Grancis dungeon related to the game's lore and the game world's moon, where the final boss would be fought. Dragon's Dogma eventually got overshadowed by what would later become two of the biggest titles in RPG gaming. The story was criticized of being flat, and the game world felt empty, but there was one thing Dragon's Dogma did well, really well. The 150 strong staff being mostly carried over from Devil May Cry 4, Capcom knew how to make combat feel good, and they built on that with new mechanics that would define Dragon's Dogma combat to this day. When fighting large monsters, Itsuno wanted to empower the player and gave them a set of tools to take out even the biggest enemies in a satisfying manner. But even though this had such a big impact on gameplay, modern RPG games like Elden Ring still opt for the outdated way of fighting big bosses. Another thing Dragon's Dogma excelled at was combat flow and variety. Attack animations were smooth and weighty compared to Dark Souls and Skyrim, but the icing on the cake was without a doubt the magic system. Not only did we have access to some really flashy and grand spells, we could acquire all the elements as a sorcerer. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what makes the magic feel good in Dragon's Dogma. The best way I can explain it is that in other games we are able to borrow the elements to cast spells, but in Dragon's Dogma you become the elements. Another defining mechanic in Dragon's Dogma was of course the pawn system. The way Itsuno explained this idea was that he wanted to create an offline-online experience. Back in 2012 this was a bold experiment, and the way this would work was that players would create their own pawn or follower they could build and teach in their own world. But they could also send their pawn to other worlds to gain experience online, giving a sense of community. And people would of course try to make their pawns as attractive as possible. But the way you could teach this AI to play in a certain way was also very new back then. Of course, for that reason, your pawns wouldn't always do what you wanted in combat, and the system was flawed to say the least. But with the knowledge and technology we have today, I can't wait to see the improved AI and pawn system in Dragon's Dogma 2. While traversing the world in Dragon's Dogma felt fun and challenging, especially at nighttime when enemies were stronger and spawned in new locations, the world could feel a bit empty, and walking back from finished quests would feel like a chore sometimes. Luckily, you get access to port crystals that could be placed at key locations, giving us fast access to the far reaches of the map. One thing though becomes very clear after watching the speedrun of the game: there was simply not enough content. To remedy that, Itsuno was forced to scatter out quests and encounters in a way that would make your playthrough last longer. Sadly, because of this, I think many players never even made it into the endgame, where you see some big changes to enemy spawns that partly address the issue with the world feeling empty. But the real endgame finally did exactly that. And this expansion doubled down on two things they knew was important for the players: less walking and more combat encounters. This re-release of the original game was massive in terms of content and gave the players new devastating abilities and new high-level weapons and armor sets for players venturing into the depths of Bitter Black Isle. Dark Arisen also introduced new questlines and a new final boss that would pose a great challenge to even the strongest Arisen beating the main game. But the true success of this expansion came from how well Capcom and Kento Kinoshita's team understood their core player base. Since Kinoshita is returning to work with Hideaki in the sequel, I have high hopes we see Bitter Black Isle return in some form as well. When you step foot onto the island, it only takes a minute to get right into the action, and the maze-like structure of the map combined with clever enemy placements reduce the action downtime we experienced in the main game to an absolute minimum. And this is why Dark Arisen is so appealing to a majority of the Dragon's Dogma community. We get gradually harder challenges thrown at us until we reach Daemon, and on top of that, we get a completely new and even harder challenge running through the maze the second time after beating Daemon. You will also encounter the actual fucking Grim Reaper in here, which I think is an absolutely badass enemy concept I hope they bring back in the sequel. But the thing is, on January 27, 2015, Capcom already had announced a sequel with a new story titled Dragon's Dogma Online. It was a free-to-play game for the PlayStation and PC, with support for cross-platform play. Dragon's Dogma Online reached more than 2 million downloads within its first 10 days of release, but as of December 2019, Dragon's Dogma Online servers have been shut down due to player count, as it was only accessible natively in Japan. Personally, I never understood this decision by Capcom, but if they did this to allocate teams to work on the sequel instead, then this makes complete sense now. I have been lucky enough to actually play the game after it was shut down, thanks to a team of passionate players restoring the game piece by piece for over 2 years. This version of the game made some crucial changes to the vocations and combat that we see return in the sequel, and I think the MMO have influenced Dragon's Dogma 2 in more ways than we realize. Now, they also launched a Netflix adaptation of the game in 2020. I'm not sure if I would recommend any of you to watch it, since it left me with pretty mixed feelings, but it brought some much needed attention to the game, which increased the player base in return. Today, 11 years after the first game was released, a sequel is only a couple of months away, and I dare say that the Dragon's Dogma community is no longer a cult following. Skyrim, Dark Souls and Elden Ring fans are all excited for the release of the next big RPG title that is Dragon's Dogma 2. And this time, following the success of Elden Ring, I believe Itsuno and his team will reach new heights and finally achieve true mainstream recognition, standing on the shoulders of giants.